Morning, everyone. Welcome to the Atlantic Council. Thank you all for joining the Atlantic Council Global Energy Center and the Atlantic Council South Asia Center for this mini conference on energy access and energy security in India. My name is Randy Bell, and I'm the director of the Global Energy Center here at the Atlantic Council. And it's an honor to have such a remarkable group of speakers with us this morning for this timely conversation. This event was inspired by this new book edited by Shreerupa Mitra, who is the executive director of the Energy Forum in Delhi. It's called Energizing India, Fueling a Billion Lives. Unfortunately, right now it's only available in India, but we hope that changes. We'll be discussing the book in the first part of the program later in a little bit. It's really been a great pleasure for the Global Energy Center to partner with our South Asia Center this year as our work grows to examine energy security and energy access in South Asia. This energy access and energy security in South Asia is the regional focus this year of our Global Energy Forum in Abu Dhabi this coming January. We'll have a number of key stakeholders from the region joining the dialogue about the geopolitics of the energy transformation. So if you want to find out more about what we're doing in Abu Dhabi this January, please don't hesitate to ask me or one of my colleagues afterwards. I want to remind everyone today that the discussion is on the record, streaming live, and will be archived on the Council's YouTube channel. So don't say anything that your children will be embarrassed about or your parents will be embarrassed about. You can join the conversation on Twitter by following at AC Global Energy and at AC South Asia and using the hashtag AC Energy. Thank you all for being here today. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to welcome to the stage Ambassador Amit Kumar, the Deputy Chief of Mission at the Indian Embassy here in Washington, for opening remarks.
A very warm good morning to all of you. Thank you for those opening remarks, Randall. Dr. Irfan Nuruddin, Director of South Asia Center at the Council, Ms. Shreerupa Mitra, the Executive Director of the Energy Forum. Let me begin by thanking the Atlantic Council for organizing this important discussion on issues relating to energy access and security in India. As the Indian economy grows and eventually moves towards a $5 trillion economy mark, access to clean, green and affordable energy will be a critical development challenge. I would in my remarks try to provide an overview of the electricity landscape in India, the challenges that we face, some of the measures that are being taken and are being considered by the government, as well as the importance of the United States as a valuable partner in our endeavor to realize energy access for all our people. India presently is the world's third largest producer and third largest consumer of electricity. It is estimated that India will account for 1/3 of the additional global demand for electricity in the coming years. The total installed capacity for electricity generation in India is around 370 gigawatts. However, the gross electricity consumption per capita in India is far lower compared to most other countries. Our move to energize each village in the country with electricity was a major success story from last year, given our large population, remote locations, and low affordability. According to the United Nations 2019 Multidimensional Poverty Index, we lifted over 270 million Indian citizens out of extreme poverty over the last decade, and access to energy and growing electrification was identified as one of the key drivers for that process. Our overall improvement in provision of electricity is also recognized in the World Bank's ease of doing business, the getting electricity parameter, where we have jumped from 137 in 2014 to 24th rank in 2018. At the same time, this is a work in progress for us. We have many more, ambitions to scale here. As the next step, the government has already committed to bringing electricity to every household by 2022. I think an even more ambitious goal would be to provide electricity to all households on a 24/7 basis. At the moment, India has surplus power generation capacity but lack adequate distribution infrastructure. One of the challenges that we will face comes from the matrix of sources that we use to generate electricity. It is dominated by the fossil fuel, in particular coal, and the fossil fuel, including coal, contributed to around 2/3 of our electricity generation. Government has made a concerted effort to expand India's renewable energy base. Power plants using renewable sources of energy, including hydroelectric power plants, comprise around 35% of our installed capacity. On the renewable power side, government has set a target of 175 gigawatts by 2022. We have achieved around 80 gigawatts as of now. Overall, this includes 60 gigawatts from wind, 100 gigawatts from solar power, 10 gigawatts from biomass, and 5 gigawatts from small hydropower projects. The government is preparing a rent-a-roof policy for supporting its target of generating 40 gigawatts of power through solar rooftop projects. We are also trying to use LEDs for all our public lighting needs, and we hopefully will achieve this target by the end of this year. This amounts to a saving of $6.25 billion on an annual basis. The estimated renewable energy in India is about 900 gigawatts from commercially exploitable sources. Of this, solar power alone accounts for around 750 gigawatts. Harnessing this solar energy and indeed some other forms of renewable energy poses challenges relating to energy storage and grid stabilization due to the inherent nature of non-regular supply from such sources, power supply from such sources. Government has also approved a new national policy on biofuels in 2018, which is expected to bring benefits in several areas: health benefits for consumers, cleaner environment, employment generation, and boost to infrastructure investment in our rural areas, and hopefully additional income for farmers. As I mentioned, we need not only more energy but also cleaner and green energy. So combating climate change and air pollution is a priority for us. This will require curbing the use of coal in power generation and industry. A number of steps, including the National Action Policy on Climate Change, our initiative on the International Solar Alliance, National Policy on Biofuels, the Clean Energy cess on coal production, are some of the measures taken by the government to move ahead in this direction. In 2017, the electricity sector accounted for more than 40% of overall primary energy resources consumed in India. This share is likely to increase further in coming years. It is therefore critically important that the electricity sector remains viable and attractive for the overall sustainability of the economy. Here, the key challenge is to determine the optimum level of electricity tariff structures. Since revenue recovery from consumers will ensure the smooth functioning of the power sector cycle comprising distribution, transmission, and generation. At the moment, we are experiencing overall distress in the power sector due to inability of distribution companies to recover sufficient revenue from consumers. I think the government is looking at different methodologies to determine cost of supply of electricity for different consumer categories, including household, industrial, and commercial consumers. The effort is to also ensure that tariffs do not overburden the poorer section of consumers, given the positive social impact of electricity provision to households. Under India's federal governance structure, power is a concurrent subject, and the responsibility for distribution and supply of power to consumers rests with different states of India. The federal government is working closely with state governments to address the challenges that they are facing in the distribution on the distribution side. The Government of India had launched a scheme called Ujjwal Discoms Assurance Yojana to encourage operational and financial turnaround of state-owned power distribution companies with an aim to reduce the aggregate technical and commercial losses to 15%. For several years, the power sector in India was plagued by substantially high technical and commercial losses. Around 2005, these were estimated to be around 34%. Over one decade, these were brought down to 24% by 2015, and the target was to reduce it further to 15% in the next 5 years. Perhaps Shreerupa can provide an update in this regard. But I think we need to recognize that even at 15%, this figure is substantially higher when compared to developed countries, because some transmission losses are inevitable because electricity is lost when it is transferred to conductors and transformers and through the wires. But 15% is still high, so hopefully in the coming decade we'll have a more ambitious target for this on this scope. In terms of changes that the government is looking at, we have brought in amendments to the Electricity Act 2003, and these envisage separation of generation and transmission, direct transfer of subsidy benefits to consumers with a view to address the distortion that is caused by cross-subsidy in India. Looking at penal provisions for violation of power purchase agreements, integrating use of smart meters and prepaid meters, and framing related regulations. Now, as we gear up to meet challenges of addressing our energy requirements, we see the United States as a valuable partner. The India-US strategic partnership has steadily widened and deepened over the past decade, steadily on the basis of several convergences. Of these, the energy dialogue has been an important pillar. In June 2017, President Trump and Prime Minister Modi decided to elevate the energy dialogue to a level of strategic energy partnership, and the two countries have been pursuing cooperation in oil and gas, power and energy efficiency, renewable energy, sustainable growth, and coal as the primary pillars. A number of joint working groups have been set up. In 2018, we also imported $4.8 billion worth of natural gas from the United States. These imports are likely to surpass $8 billion this year, and given our energy requirements in the coming years, India would be a potentially large and stable market for the United States. As some of you might be aware, during the visit of Prime Minister Modi to the United States in September 2019, Petronet, Indian company, signed an MOU with Messrs. Tellurian to invest $2.5 billion to set up LNG terminals to support supply of LNG to India. This investment would create more than 50,000 direct and indirect jobs in 13 states across the US. The two companies are also looking at long-term LNG supply contracts for 20 to 40 years. India and the US are also working on supporting basic research and technology development in collaboration with the industry to harness potential of solar energy, second generation biofuels, energy efficient building technologies, smart grids and energy storage, clean coal technologies, and carbon capture. Admittedly, the biggest challenge for us is reducing reliance on coal. There is a need to strike a balance between consumption of fossil fuel and renewable energy to protect jobs in the coal sector, to ensure base load stability, and to address climate concerns. We believe that technology input is a critical input in this area and can lead to a more sustainable solution for India's challenges. We need to recognize that while we are trying to bring down exposure to coal, it will continue to be a major source of energy, likely to contribute more than 50% of our electricity generation in at least the next 2 decades. For reference, the current level is around 66%. So it is imperative that the bilateral partnership with the US and clean coal technology is strengthened further. I think Shreerupa will talk about this. We need to ensure longer-term planning to balance out our universal energy access requirements and meeting our commitments on the Paris Agreement to promote sustainable and inclusive growth, as well as provide facilitate energy access for all our people. And the government is consulting relevant stakeholders on a regular basis. I think it is in this backdrop, I think this book, The Energy India Fueling a Billion Lives, which has been edited by Shreerupa, and which brings together views of leading energy experts, academics, and policymakers on various facets of energy-related issues in India and the world, will be a very valuable addition to this ongoing conversation on issues of energy access and security in India. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Kumar. We really appreciate that. Your remarks about India's impressive plans to both provide more energy for its people while also cleaning up its energy mix. Really impressive what's happening. I'd like to now welcome to the stage Shreerupa for a conversation about her book, Energizing India. So everyone, give a hand for Shreerupa. So Shreerupa, before we get into the substance, I want to talk first just a little bit about the book. What was the impetus for it? How did you get such big names like Dan Yergin and Bob Dudley to write essays for it? And what do you hope the book will accomplish?
Thank you, Randolph, for having me here, and thank you, everyone, for taking the time out to come for this mini conference. As you know, in India, there are 5 verticals of energy, and for me, they often have different objectives and different ways of working, let's say. So the book primarily intended to get the best names globally who have worked on India but have a vast global perspective as well, to see where we stand in terms of the recent reforms that have been made, to give a very objective analysis. And it was very interesting to see how each subject expert had their own view on how India should undergo its energy transition, how it should decarbonize, and how it's... So the idea was to have all these big names talking about areas that they feel India should focus on. And so that was but the book was mainly the idea of Minister Pradhan, who was the Minister of Petroleum and Natural Gas and Steel, and he thought it's a good idea to have a comprehensive book which really analyzed and assessed the recent reforms that have been made in the energy sector. And I was just fortunate enough because I knew Dr. Yergin and Mr. Dudley, and thanks to also Minister Pradhan, we were able to get these people to come together to talk about the energy sector in India.
And what do you think the book will? How do you think the book will help drive the changes that you're hoping to see in India?
I hope it has enriched the conversation. I hope, because I don't know if there are so many big names who have come together to write on India specifically. So I do hope that it has highlighted some of the positive strides that have been made, as well as things that need to be done. And I do hope that policy, it feeds into policy. And I think I really enjoyed reading the article, so I think it has fed into the conversation.
Well, let's talk about the policy. What's been in the news the most recently is the air pollution in Delhi. We're just through some of the worst part of the year for air pollution, and one of the worst years on record. Over the last 20 days, PM 2.5 averaged 25 times the World Health Organization guidelines for safe levels. So, of course, the pollution doesn't only come from the energy sector, and it's exacerbated by weather conditions this time of year, et cetera. But perhaps you could talk about the causes and how the Indian government plans to address the range of causes to really try to clean up the air.
Yeah,
because
unfortunately,
we were talking just about how it impacted you when you were there.
Right. Yes, of course. It is a challenge and a matter of concern for policymakers, for the government, and for residents as well. And it is, of course, needless to say, it's not an easy solution. It has to be. It'll take some time to clean up the air. But some of I think the question that you asked, it can be divided into two sort of parts, like the things that have been done and which will take some time to show its effect. Pet coke has been banned, for instance, except for, I think, for industries like the cement industry. Furnace fuel has been banned in NCR, which is the National Capital Region of Delhi, which is Delhi and it's the outlying areas. Then there is, of course, Euro 6 standard. Fuel was supposed to be launched in 2020, so that got pushed ahead to 2018, so April 2018. We have the third largest CNG fleet, I think, in the world, which is, of course, a big number. And Euro 6 diesel engines are almost as clean as Euro 6 CNG engines. So and also there are pilot projects underway. For instance, Indian Oil is trying to spike hydrogen with I'm not a scientist, so please forgive me if the details are a little here and there, but the point is that they're trying to spike hydrogen with gas, which sort of can be fed into the already existing fleet without really making changes in the engines, and which brings down emissions by 60 to 70%. So that's a pilot, it's called. The CNG stations will have a pilot is being done near Rajghat, which is near Mahatma Gandhi's memorial. So the CNG stations will have partial reforming units to try this out, and I think the pilot runs for about 6 months, if I'm not mistaken.
That's fascinating. There's so much work being done on hydrogen and
right.
Mixing it into gas streams around the world.
Right, yeah. right. Then there is they have a city bio waste to gas project, which is again a pilot. There are about 12 2G ethanol plants that are being set up, which will use about 700 tons of agricultural waste to produce about 100 tons of ethanol. As you may know, that there is a new national biofuel policy since 2018, which has expanded the feedstock that can be used for generating biofuel. And that is there's another major emphasis of the oil ministry. Then when we speak of agricultural waste, I think we were talking about this, that it's also a cultural issue, right? It's also that you burn this waste because it generates heat, and we have really, really low per capita energy consumption. It's 1/3 of the global average. So people really don't have access to basic forms of energy. So these are cultural ways of of dealing with, say, weather and so it is. So these are things that have been done, and Ujjwala was one program, the Pradhan Mantri Ujjwala Yojana, which got LPG to the doorstep of the customers. So I think we reached the 8th crore connection very recently. These are steps that are being taken. It is going to take time, of course, but and also, there's another initiative to convert used cooking oil to biodiesel. So many of these are in the pilot stage and are being in the next about 6 months to 8 months, we'll see how far they can be scaled up. Agricultural waste, you need to, there's a problem of aggregation, and there's a problem of there are things that need to be thought through, like where would the plants be situated close to the field so that there is an uninterrupted supply of, say, agricultural waste, etc. So all of these things these are some of the policy level changes that are being sort of implemented as we speak.
What I like about this is that you're not making one bet, one really big bet, but a whole bunch of different bets.
It has to be that. Because it's a lot of things that come together, right? It's a socio-economic problem. It's a cultural issue. It is also
Right. And you have, as a portfolio set of solutions, you have a range of different opportunities to solve this problem. So I hope you'll come back next year and tell us about what's working, why it worked, what isn't working, and why it failed, etc. That would be really fascinating. I do want to talk about one particular bet that India is making on natural gas, and Ambassador Kumar mentioned this. Some of the efforts to import more natural gas, right now I think it makes up about 6% of the total energy mix, and the goal is to bring it up to 15%.
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, and as you mentioned already, switching from diesel to CNG vehicles in cities really helped with air quality.
Predated the BS6, intervention.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But also, India has 12 gigawatts of idle gas power generation. There's just not enough gas coming in. So can you talk about the plan to bring in more gas, and what are the roadblocks to reaching that 15%? What you need to do to get India there?
Right. It is an ambitious number. 15% is not a mean number. There are a lot of things that, but having said that, I think this government is very clear that Minister Pradhan and Prime Minister Modi, that we are that India should become a gas-based economy. It has been repeated many times in public speeches, and so for that, I think about let's say $60 billion was just announced as that would be invested in building energy infrastructure. Then there was, of course, the Satat program, which is the sustainable alternative to affordable transportation, which plans to set up 5,000 CBG plants. Then, of course, I spoke about the Ujjwala scheme. 70% of the population has already been brought under piped natural gas. Then there is, of course, there's a huge sort of emphasis on city gas networks, city gas distribution. So I think about 400 out of 600 districts, the smaller, you know what a district is, have been brought under CGD network. Of course, there are stumbling blocks in the sense that coal it's difficult to compete with coal simply for the reason that it's abundant. Renewable is coming down, the per unit cost. But yeah, so and also domestic gas production has not been doing that well, and but the KG basin, I don't know if you know the KG basin. Yeah, so it should be functional from 2020. So that's a big chunk of domestic production if that happens there. And there are many sort of policy enablers that the government has put in recent times, like the HELP program or the OALP, which is open acreage licensing policy, which is it allows the stakeholder, the private player, to really carve out blocks that and put in a expression of interest to the government, and you can have a single license for conventional and non-conventional fuels. So these are, of course, these are sort of policy enablers which we hope will, sort of spur domestic investment in domestic production of gas.
Now, if India achieves its 15% goal, how do you think that will change the lives of ordinary citizens? How does that impact development? How does that impact economic growth?
Well, it's clean. It's a clean source of energy, right?
Mm-hmm.
And hopefully the economics work out. It's cheaper, mm-hmm. So just have cleaner air, and it's easier to access. Like LPG has really sort of course, every scheme can be further developed and can be nuanced further to cater to various populations, etc. But LPG, for instance, has women's health has improved. They have more time to sort of focus on other issues like other things like sort of bolstering their income, focusing on children's education, going into sort of collecting firewoods took up a huge chunk of women's time, like and apart from that, it's just unsafe, to go into the forest and collect firewood. So that has a tremendous impact, for instance, on women's lives. So so it's just an easier.
Mm-hmm. Once people get access to gas, it's hard to go back to any previous forms of energy that they're using.
Right.
I want to pivot to the final part of the conversation. I know your favorite part, your specialty, geopolitics and energy security. As an importing nation, India has to be particularly attentive to geopolitical changes that could impact supply. So on oil, how has India managed sanctions on Iranian oil exports? And now how does it see some of the increasing tensions in the Gulf that have at least temporarily threatened some supply?
I think we imported, it's zero now from Iran, of course.
But how did you manage that change?
The OMCs managed. They managed to balance the demand and the supply. They have done well thus far. We have to pay attention to the geopolitics of the day. It's and our national interest is foremost, of course. Having said that, it was not easy, when the second waiver was not granted, and it was not a easy thing to do, to withdraw that amount. We are the third largest crude importer, so that was really not an easy thing. India is a very, very price sensitive country, as you know. It is a major issue even during elections. So, but we did, the Indian government did what it had to do, given what the situation was. Middle East crisis has a real impact on our economy, and so one of the strategies is, of course, to diversify sources. So we've started importing from US, for instance. In 2 years, it has gone to about, like Ambassador Kumar was saying, to about 6 billion, and should go up to 8 billion under the gas task force. We've gone to Russia. We are and of course shale has upended this whole pricing dynamic. So even during the worst crisis, say the Aramco attacks or the Strait of Hormuz, the prices went up during the
Right.
Upkek and Kure attacks, but they came back within about 10 days to hovering about $60 to $65. So one of the main strategies has been to say to diversify our import. So that's.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
We have time for just one or two questions from the audience
Sure.
before we have to wrap up and move on to the first panel. Is there anyone out there who has a question for Shreerupa on any of these topics? We have a question right there in the front, and the microphone will be coming towards you right now.
Hi, my name is Jacob Lee from Johns Hopkins University. So you talked about natural gas supply diversification and import. So my question is, will there be any chance that India will import natural gas from Russia?
From Russia?
Yep.
Potentially. Potentially, I mean, yeah.
I think that's the answer. Any other questions? We have a question right up here on the other side in the front. Microphone is on its way.
Hi, I'm Emily Meredith from Energy Intelligence. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about this idea of the Indian government selling its stake in Bharat Petroleum and what the logic might be, and who you think would be interested. Middle East players don't seem to be. Is it IOCs? Is it other regional oil companies that you think make sense, maybe from a geopolitical angle?
I can only say that I think the logic is that Prime Minister Modi believes that a government has no business being in business. So we'll see who all would be interested. Can't comment more on that yet.
Thank you so much, Shreerupa. This is fantastic. And for when you're in India, everyone go and please buy her book. And we'll see if we can get some copies here in the United States. I'd now like to welcome my colleague Bina Hussain to the stage to get the first panel started. So everyone please give Shreerupa a round of applause.
Done? Oh. Done. Get some waters for them. Yeah, okay. Okay, while they're getting some waters for the panelists, why don't you all just join me and stay on stage in the meantime, and then we'll get started while they continue to set up, finalize. I can take that. Oh. Go ahead, yeah. Thank you all for being here today for our mini conference. My name is Bina Hussain, and I'm an associate director here with the Atlantic Council Global Energy Center. And it's my pleasure to be moderating this panel on ensuring energy access in India, which, as the ambassador and Shreerupa noted, is one of the key issues going on in India. While the country has done quite a bit to improve energy access, still a lot remains to be done when it comes to infrastructure, to investment. Just in 2015, it was estimated that around 300 million people lacked energy access. I think today that's a very different number. But, and the country has said, as both the ambassador and Shreerupa have commented on, set incredibly ambitious targets to not just provide access to energy, but also to diversify the energy mix. So, a lot still remains to be done, considering that India is not just one of the most populous nations today, but is expected to become the most populous nation, surpassing even China over the next decade or so. So demand will continue to grow, but also the need to continue to generate access to energy for folks around the country will be an issue that remains for the foreseeable future. So we have a great panel of a range of expertise here. I do want to acknowledge that we don't have an Indian on the panel, which is too bad, but I'm sure we could compensate for that. So first I'd like to introduce Jane Somers, who's the Senior Energy Advisor with the Asia Bureau at the U.S. Agency for International Development. I've got right next to me Griffin Thompson, Director of the Office of Renewable Energy and Efficiency at State Department. Lauren Diekman, Senior Director of Energy, Infrastructure and Environment at the U.S.-India Business Council. And last but not least, Johannes Urpilainen, and I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that right. Close enough. I'll take it. Okay, thank you. Who's a professor and director of the Energy, Resources and Environment Program at Johns Hopkins SAIS. Thank you all for being here. So, Johns, I want to talk to you first a little bit. You've done, just to kind of get, a perspective of what's being done on a local level, you've done a lot of research on Saubhagya, and I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that correctly. Palak was teaching me this morning. So, scheme, an initiative that is aimed to provide electricity to all households in India, was announced in 2017. How successful is this initiative so far? And based on the research and the data you have, what is the reality on the ground?
So the Saubhagya scheme is really intended to provide every Indian household with electricity access. And the way they do it is they provide these free connections for any household that is below the national poverty line, and a heavily subsidized connection for anybody above the poverty line. The challenge here is that the scheme does not provide additional subsidies for electricity consumption. So even if you get a free connection, it is not an obvious thing that you would actually want it, because you would then have to start paying these monthly bills that could be very costly if you are a poor farmer. Based on the data that we have collected, the electricity access rate has certainly gone up significantly. 300 million, I don't think it's anywhere near that number anymore. I think we are looking at well below 100 million. But the reality still is that in many of the poorer states in the northern parts, we still have significant numbers of households without. We just got the latest numbers from our surveys in one of the states, Jharkhand, which is probably kind of a lower bound. It's one of the poorer states in India. And there we estimate an electrification rate of 85% in the rural areas. So that's well below 100%, but it's a significant improvement over the about 60% just 3-4 years ago.
So the ambassador commented or noted that the aim is to be 100% by 2022, 24/7 electricity. Do you think that's likely to be reached?
I hope not, because if a state like Jharkhand were to provide 24/7 electricity to a population that is not able to pay for it, the fiscal implications for the power sector would be terrifying, right? So I think the more important thing is that what we need to see is rapid economic growth that benefits the rural population. I mean, when people are actually able to afford these services, that's when 24/7 becomes a realistic prospect.
All right. Jane, let me bring you in. USAID obviously is helping the government, not just in the energy transition, but also doing a lot of work on energy access. and but sustainable, affordable, and clean energy access, I should say, probably. So what do you see as the major hurdles, and how is USAID helping the Indian government to reach a success?
So USAID has been working in India for decades on energy now, both at the bilateral level directly with the government as well as with the regional, trying to get a regional power grid. On the energy access side, we've been working both on large-scale energy, particularly renewable energy deployment, to help the government reach its ambitious targets. But also on the energy access side, we have a program called Clean Energy Access Network. And so over the last 6 years alone, we've helped connect about 5 million individuals for the grid, and so some of our tactics have been working with microfinance, working with women and women entrepreneurs to try to go through private sector to facilitate more private sector transactions. I think in the broader level, it's really not just energy access, but energy. Is it reliable energy? So, or is it there are many blackouts or other things, right? So, it's also connected to energy security. Just connecting a household, like's been said, is not necessarily in and of itself the end goal. There are other goals, and now we're really looking at the development outcomes of the energy. So in addition to livelihoods, there's health, education, and other
environmental issues.
Environmental and air pollution issues, as was mentioned. So I think on a broader level, it's bigger than just energy access, but certainly that's one of the areas we work in.
Well, and we hope that today we're actually maybe not painting a full picture, but a half picture by covering a lot more and having a discussion on energy security after this as well. Jane, in actually it was last year, I think, Asia Edge was announced, Indo-Pacific strategy by the US government. Can you tell a little bit more of how that's going, whether, where I think a commitment of $50 million of investment was made by the United States. We're a year in. Could you tell a little bit of how it's going and where we are today?
Yeah, sure. So on July 30th of 2018, the U.S. government announced Asia Edge, which is enhancing development and growth through energy. That $50 million you referenced was a down payment on future out-year funding, which we have received this year, additional funding for Asia Edge. This is a whole of government initiative, so there's 8 different agencies in the platform, and USAID has one of the larger funding streams for this. I would say we've ramped up activities pretty quickly for Asia Edge. We've had a business forum just earlier this month in Bangkok to announce some of the results of this. So there's been significant dollars of investment mobilized in the past year under Asia Edge. And our USAID missions, and we have quite a number of them with energy programs, have been rolling out and expanding their activities. I would say one of the unique aspects of EDGE is that we have stood up an Asia Gas partnership to expand from what was primarily power sector work in previous years to now doing some fossil fuel and cleaner fossil activities. So I would say it's been an ambitious and heavy lift this past year, but I think we've done quite well.
So I think this is a great opportunity to bring Lauren and Griffin into that conversation as well. A U.S. whole government initiative. Griffin, State Department is involved in that. which is diplomacy focused, it's foreign policy focused. Why is it involved in programs like this? How does it, especially focused on energy access, I'd like to say, because we are talking about energy access. And then, Lauren, maybe you could speak a little bit to the private sector. How are they engaging in energy access as well through initiatives such as Asia Edge, but also more broadly?
Sure, Bina, thanks for the question. And Jane points us in the right direction when she says energy access is more about energy. But the reality is that the insularity of our conversation and the epistemological contraction of the problem is limiting our reach. In other words, we're thinking too small. We've made a huge problem smaller by looking at individual components of what is a large systemic issue. We've made tremendous progress, as we've heard, on energy access, and we have evolved through different stages. Early on in the conversation, a couple decades ago, it was all about the machine. And we remain fixated on the machine. In fact, we in the West have a pathological passion for the machine. If there's any problem we have in society, create a machine for it. We've turned political and social problems into technical problems. In the vernacular of today, it's the app. Right. If you have a problem, create an app. Oh, you can't find a date? We have an app for you. Don't think perhaps that you're acting like a jackass. That's why you're not getting a date. Don't alter your behavior, get an app. And so somehow
you realize you're being recorded, right?
We somehow...
I'm just flagging it.
I don't... You know, it's... And what I'm saying is that we have to think bigger. We have to think much bigger. And energy is much more than electrons pulsating through wires or molecules moving through pipelines. It is a larger issue in terms of how do we connect people. We should be, and I've known every person on this panel for a number of years, and they're all doing marvelous work. You have all the right people. You got industry, you got academia, you got development. But as we move, we have learned that it's not a technical issue, it's an anthropological issue, it's a cultural issue, as Shreerupa points out. We have these vertical ministries, and God forbid we talk to one another. But the reality of the real world is that the real world mixes everything into one messy, combined whole. And what we bureaucratically try to bifurcate and fragment, the real world defies that. And so we have moved slowly but resistantly from a technical perspective to a cultural anthropological perspective. And now, but we still are not talking to the people and including the people we need to bring in. Energy is a means. Nobody cares about energy. What we care about are energy services. We want cold beer, hot showers, instant access to the internet. We want mobility. So what a great energy access panel, with all due respect to the Atlantic Council, because you guys are doing exactly what everybody else does, is you ought to have an educator up here. You ought to have a health professional here. You ought to have somebody from agriculture. Shreerupa talked about the issue of burning agro-waste. Well, how does energy service delivery get to the farmers? And why are the farmers resistant? How do educators plan on educating the millions of kids that need education in the absence of the energy services of electricity, internet, mobility? How are health professionals going to inoculate women and children around the world without energy services? We continue to talk only to amongst ourselves, energy professionals to energy professionals, and until we break out of that, we're not going to have as much success as we need. And that's why the State Department cuts across all these issues. Energy is the antecedent condition, everything on the development agenda, and we're increasingly looking at energy as the subtext to just about everything on the diplomatic agenda. Energy has a critical intersection with immigration, labor, human rights, democratization and governance, all across the board, and that's what we're trying to do in India, and I can talk more about the specifics of what the State Department is doing in India and energy access in due course. Thank you.
That was good. That was great. Lauren.
So I think when you're talking about the private sector and their role in energy access, I mean, private sector has recognized that it's a huge market opportunity. I think the Department of Commerce said that it was a $48 billion opportunity by the year 2030.
Right.
And so industry is able to take entrepreneurial risks that others might not be able to do. They help bring innovation and technologies like energy storage, smart grids, mini grids, off-grid solutions. And when they work with governments and other mechanisms that are in place, they can help bring in innovative business models that bring in financing and help really, expand energy access. It also helps, as villages are electrified, that helps with skill development, what companies need as they're looking to expand their operations in India, things like that.
So in recent years, the government of India has taken quite a few steps to deregulate some of the industry and encourage greater private sector participation and foreign investment. How have you seen, as you are representing a lot of businesses and aiming to improve business between US and India, how have you seen that impact investing in India, and have you seen and is there anything else that the Indian government could do to improve policies or whatnot to increase foreign investment even further?
Yeah, I think a lot of the policies that we've seen come out recently have helped improve investor confidence. Companies are looking at India a lot differently than they used to. They're also looking more and more at the state level, so kind of drilling down into state policies has been helpful. Obviously, there's always more that can be done. Policies that help protect innovators are always helpful, and like Griff mentioned, working with across industries, talking to the ag sector, educators, companies are investing their CSR funds in energy access projects.
Okay. Let's open it up to questions as well. Because I'd like to engage you all more into the conversation as we have limited time. We've got one here in the front, Sarah. Please state your name and affiliation. I would appreciate if you ask a question.
Thank you for organizing this very interesting conversation. I'm Saurav Akshari from SBB Energy International. So I lived in India for many years as a student, and this Subhagaya program as an energy consultant at this part of my life has been very interesting, and we did a lot of studies. So one thing that has been actually raised is that cultural issue. From 2017 that was announced, there were many among industries in India that they were very pessimist about the Modi's scheme, but now that we are moving on, it has been moved very well. But now that it has been reached to these farmer levels or these rural areas, I wonder what are the cultural, maybe Shreerupa could also answer this question, what are the cultural schemes or programs to introduce these to the families, because what we know is that we are in contact with some of the major gurus in the regions in India, that government have been reached to them and asked them to help with to culturally promote, for instance, LPG to be substituted by the wood fire. And most of the farmers tell them that simply, as Shreerupa was alluding, that it's more easier for them not to collect in wood fire, but many of them went back to the gurus and say, our family liked the taste of chapati on a wood fire better than on an LPG. So how are these cultural resistance to actually absorbing and changing the lifestyle of India from, for instance, baking chapati on a wood fire rather than on LPG would be solved? I mean, it's fascinating that Indian gurus are also involved in all the communities, but what is on a larger schemes?
All right, Griffin?
That's an excellent question, and it gets to some of the things that we're doing out of the State Department and the Energy Bureau. For the last 5 years, the Energy Bureau and my office specifically has run a U.S.-India Clean Energy Finance Task Force, where we've worked at the federal level to look at what are the changes in the policy and regulatory scaffolding in the institutions that are required to accelerate capital flow and help the market transformation get to where it wants to be. The machines work, the institutions don't. And so what we're trying to do is look at what works in the United States and elsewhere and customize those policy regulatory schemes to the exigencies of the Indian culture. We in the United States are blessed with 50 laboratories of experimentation. We call them states. Every one of the states are experimenting with different policy models, programs, and financial models of how do you make the transformation to a lower carbon energy future. we have learned and realized that the system of federalism in India mirrors the system of federalism in the United States. So a couple of years ago, we started a state and urban initiative with CSIS, and we started pairing U.S. states with Indian states, U.S. cities with Indian cities, corporations with corporations, utilities with utilities, universities, trying to get at the local level because much of the responsibility for electricity distribution is at the more local level, getting back to the cultural issue. So realizing that we need to do more work while at the federal level, but also at the state and local level, we initiated 2 new programs this last year. One is working with the states on community solar and the Solarize campaign. We're working with the state of Bihar and looking at how does community solar work, how do we gather people coming together primarily, and this is the fascinating point, and it gets to my earlier comments, primarily as consumers, but by bringing them together to help decide how they are going to achieve their energy services, we quickly turn them into citizens, where they start to understand and start realizing and gaining those talents of a democratic citizen, working with partners, working with their neighbors on deciding the fundamentals of politics, who gets what, where, and how. So we're working with Bihar, we're working with Delhi on a Solarize campaign. Again, looking at what are the cultural impediments, what are the cultural flows at the local level that gets us to the ends we need. The second program gets to the earlier point that Ambassador Kumar talked about, is the Flexible Resource Initiative. Looking at it's not either or, it's both and. How do we maximize the value of natural gas, storage, and renewable energy as we move them into the grid, maintaining that flexibility?
So actually, Shreerupa would like to make a comment as well. Palak, we could get the mic here.
Thank you. Just a quick comment without, hijacking your panel.
No, like I said, we're missing the Indian voice, so please.
I didn't mean to double up in both panels, so sorry. So speaking to the Ujjwala scheme, because yours is a very valid point. The thing is that it's an access scheme. It's to nudge people to start using LPG, right? So it is, needless to say, there are many cultural factors that feed into actual translation into 100% usage, right? Because it's not only, like I said, it's also for heating. It's also, older women say the food doesn't get digested properly. So it is also a part of what is called technology stacking. Just like in our homes, we have different technologies to cook. They have different, so in summer maybe they would use the LPG more frequently than in the winters, and it's also a way of social gathering. You gather around the chula. There are religious ceremonies associated with the mud chula. So obviously this is not an overnight change. It can never be, because it's a deeply cultural the way you cook is a cultural act, right? So and the LPG has done fantastically because it is an access scheme. It is primarily an access scheme, and of course translation to 100% usage will take time. If that helps, I don't know. Yeah.
Sorry. You can give it to, yeah, we have a question in the back over there.
Hi, my name is Mohinder Gulati. I worked with the World Bank and with the United Nations, Sustainable Energy for All. I was very glad that at the panel, in the panel somebody talked about more systemic approach, that we are looking at the silos and therefore we need to look at the systemic approach. The excess, that is the subject that we are talking about, that it is not just a mere connection of pulling a wire into the house, but the access has to be reliable, affordable, sustainable. And access is not only for the light bulb, it also has to be for use of appliances, for use by the small and micro enterprises in the community, also for the community use. So access has a much larger dimension than just pulling the connection into the house and putting a light bulb. So we can take this machine approach and say, okay, here's the technology, here is a machine, here is the wire and the power station. But who are the ones who are delivering it? What are the instruments of delivery of those services? And the institutions that are supposed to deliver those are the power utilities, and they are all mostly government owned. And these government-owned utilities, and I'm talking in the context of electricity and not gas, it is the state-owned power distribution companies which have very high level of losses. 20 to 25% is the general range. They have about 20 to 25% of electricity being supplied to agriculture, which pays next to nothing, which means obviously this has to be paid for by the state. And some of it is paid by the cross-subsidizing by the industry, and therefore the industrial tariffs go up, and electricity becomes more unaffordable for this, particularly for the small and medium enterprises who cannot afford to bear those high level of tariffs. And then this has to be funded from the state budget. Every year it's about $15 billion, about 100,000 crores, or maybe 10,000 million. So $15 billion is the level of losses that they incur, and the government then has to bear it, or they fund it from the commercial banks. And some of these things have then become that has flowed into the financial sector. The unpaid debt and the stand of the sector has become a financial sector problem. On the one hand, you have unserved markets. Consumers are not getting a reliable, affordable supply. On the other hand, you have 70,000 megawatt of stranded capacity, which is mostly the private sector capacity, or now it is the state government capacity which is being backed down. That these are 70,000 megawatt of capacity which is not being utilized, not because there is no demand, but because people can't pay. And people can't pay because the costs are so high because of the high level of losses and the cost of delivery. So therefore, I think the real issue in the excess or energy security is the governance issue. It is the governance of the state-owned enterprises which are inefficient, unskilled, incompetent. They are not able to raise financing for their investments and are very badly, poorly run, politically controlled. So therefore, unless we address this issue of governance of the energy sector, these will remain band-aids and the fixes.
Right.
So that's one. If I may just take another minute, we also have to look at the energy sector from a nexus perspective. In the power sector particularly, it is also the nexus with the water and agriculture. Unless we start looking at it from the nexus perspective, improving power sector is going to be very, very difficult. Thanks.
All right, thank you, sir. I think you did mention one very important point, that's energy governance, and I think we have several people that can comment on that here. Jane, why don't we start with you?
Yes, thanks. I think that's a very good point. I mean, under our Asia Edge program and our India energy work, we've focused on utility modernization, utility reform. We've done some pilot programs with distribution companies to help them handle variable renewable energy resources that come into the grid, but also to try to improve their financial viability, because a number of distribution companies are operating in the red in India because of these subsidies or issues with bill collection, other losses, non-tariff, barriers and not technical losses. So I think that's a key point, is to try to reduce subsidies of all kind in the energy sector, of fossil fuels, of electricity, to level the playing field. The other area where we've been supporting more transparency, which goes to the governance area, is in procurements. So we've been supporting reverse auctions for renewable energy so that everyone can bid and bid down the price for renewables. And that helps people see what the true costs are. And then you can compare it to coal, hydro, and other sources. And so you can look at all your options and alternatives. And I think that will help India in the long run. So.
Jonas, if you had anything?
Yeah. So I think, first of all, you're exactly right. I think it's hard to disagree with your diagnosis. You can think of the challenge, especially at the distribution sector, as a kind of a funnel. So the first question is, what is the price of electricity? Is it roughly correct? Does it in any way reflect the cost? And the answer in many states and for many consumer segments is no. Then the second one is, are you able to actually bill the consumers? Is there some kind of document that says you need to pay for this electricity? Sometimes, quite often, the answer is no. And then if you have a bill, are you able to actually collect the money? And at this point, the answer is again often no. And when you go through this sequence in the end, the number of people who are making payments for electricity tends to be quite low. The challenge is that in the rural areas, there is very little potential for collecting except in agriculture. We did a big study of 4 Indian states, and we quantified their energy needs used across all the different sources that could be replaced with electricity. And the consumption is so low that even if you collect perfectly, you cannot even cover the cost of the meter that these households have. So the money has to come from industry, commerce, urban households, and agriculture. And therefore, I think the best hope for solving this problem is to improve the governance and then hope that at the same time the ability to pay in the different segments also improves. Right now the problem is really hard, and if we kind of get a lucky strike where you start developing some economic growth in the different areas of the economy and you combine that with governance interventions, then I think you have a much better chance of solving the problem.
Griffin, did you add anything to add?
Yeah, thank you. The question is, and the diagnosis is exactly right. And his second question mirrored and in fact converges with the first when he talks about the nexus. But then his final comment on governance is what disheartened me, because you qualified governance with energy. And that gets us back to my opening comment about we sequester energy governance into energy ministries. It reminds me of the 13th century Sufi mystic, Rumi. When he says, truth was a mirror in the hands of God, the mirror dropped to the ground and broke. We each picked up a piece, a shard of the mirror, and we thought we held the truth. No one minister, no one person, no institution holds the truth. And this particularly is true in governance. We find that in governance, if you want to include better governance for energy access, energy security, and the two are really inextricably connected, as we all know, we have to bring in the water ministries. We have to bring in the industrial ministries. We have to talk about housing ministries, because oftentimes the energy minister does not have sole authority or the purview under those issues that are going to accelerate and expand and attenuate energy poverty. We need the water minister on board. We need the finance minister on board. We need the eclectic, all the shards brought together so we can address governance. So it's not just energy governance. Energy governance manifests itself and is found in multiple agencies. So that's the horizontal side on the federal government, but there also needs to be vertical alignment. That's why we went to the subnational government. That the subnationals policies have to be in alignment with federal or vice versa. When we talk to local officials, oftentimes we hear that the biggest impediment for them to, in their expansion of energy service delivery, is federal government policy, that there's a disconnect. So this is where all spheres of authority need to be talking to one another. So we need horizontal alignment across all ministries, and we need vertical alignment between the various spheres of authority, all of which have a piece of the responsibility for access and security.
That's a lot of work.
It is a lot of work. That's why we need to make the problem, try to make the problem smaller, we need to make the problem bigger. Because by making it bigger, you bring in other actors, other stakeholders, you have a different conceptual frame, and through that expanded conceptual frame and the altered terms of discourse, we can find the solution. We have hamstrung ourselves because we've tried to let a bunch of engineers and public policy makers put them in a room and think they're going to solve it.
Okay. Any other questions? Oh, we got Bob. Oh, sure.
In Delhi, we are holding a workshop which is energy, water, and agriculture, and we are bringing the energy people, water people, and also the agriculture people from the state and the central government.
Perfect.
There you go.
There you go. It's being done.
All right.
God
we
bless
got
you.
Bob Eichord over here as a coach, who has, by the way, he's a fellow with us who has done a tremendous amount of work on the power transformation in South and Southeast Asia.
Used to be my boss.
I know all
really?
the panelists
Yes.
here. So, but but I will, and some of them, like Griff and Laura, have heard me say this before, but because I have a particular beef about it. And Griff, you've been very interested in urbanization in the cities, and obviously your comments along that way. So I mean, the thing that scares me is that India is still less than 50% urban. And this process and the forces of urbanization are going to have enormous impact in term for the energy systems and how you design them, and the role of centralized and decentralized systems. And the growing incomes of people in the urban areas, I felt, supports the idea of moving in selected cities like you've had with Tata and Delhi to try to get public investment in the distribution systems there, to relieve some of the pressure on the governments, because obviously they need all the resources they can to help deal with the rural areas, et cetera. So as Mr. Gladi, another former colleague, stated so well. So Laura, you've looked at this issue in terms of the environment for private investment, and at the city level, et cetera. Is there been any thinking about how do you mobilize the investments that are needed to meet this growing demand for electricity in the urban areas, and why can't the politicians see that it's in their interest to try to get more private investment in distribution? And Jane, you may want to comment there.
I think, it's recognized, and, they're thinking through it. Things often move slower than you would like them to. We've seen, you mentioned the Tata example. We're seeing that move into other areas, but obviously there's still a lot of work to be done.
I think I would just add that India probably has one of the better environments for private sector investment than many of the other countries in Asia that we work in. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity if there's the right enabling environment to attract private sector investment. So the right policies, sort of a level playing field for everyone to compete. And I think the cost of doing business in India in some cases has remained high because of bureaucracy or tender procurements and other things. So I think trying to streamline some of those processes, which they've made attempts to do with standardized power purchase agreements for solar and other things. I think I don't think money is the biggest issue in India, frankly, on the energy side. I think there's a lot of other issues which we've talked about here, which are bigger obstacles and barriers. So I think with the right environment, we can attract a lot more in private sector.
But to some extent, we've seen that on the generation side. And the agreements that have been signed at the state and federal level that have attracted billions of dollars of investment. But my concern is that, you've got to have investment in transmission and distribution, and where can you get that private role going so that you're going to have the capital needed to expand these distribution in the growing urban areas?
Well, your question wraps up a number of the dimensions we've been speaking about. It's cultural, it's financial, and it certainly was the premise of the creation of the U.S. India Clean Energy Finance Task Force that we started 5 years ago to look at what are the financial models that can be put in place in India to accelerate this capital flow. Now, at the time, and to a certain extent still, we were looking at the sectoral level. We weren't thinking specifically spatially at the urban level. It is, moving towards cost recovery, and Johannes pointed us in the right direction a few moments ago when he said, if everybody got 24/7 power in an environment where nobody could pay for it, it would be disastrous for the power system. So it's cultural in the fact that in many of these people, and Johannes, you can either support this with evidence or tell me I'm absolutely wrong, but saying that most of these people pay as much for their energy services as people who rely on the grid. They're paying for battery charging, charcoal, etc., or at least a greater percentage of their daily income than the middle class. So part of the issue, and Jane mentioned too, is removing subsidies. But that's a political issue. It's a social issue. It's a cultural issue, and communicating the realities of the situation. We have for far too long habituated populations around the world that energy's free. Energy is a human right. Well, guess what? When that becomes that dogma, we run into problems of cost recovery. And so it's moving towards a different model of behavior. Again, it's a behavioral issue. And what are the institutions that will encourage the right type of behavior and convince people that, yeah, if I pay more for energy, more for my electricity, I'll get better quality and I'll get what I pay for.
Actually, Jonas, you've done some research on the quality of service as well and what people were willing to pay for and not. So please.
Yeah, I think, Griff, first of all, you're right. The cost of these non-grid sources tends to be far higher on a energy service or kilowatt-hour basis. In terms of the linkage between quality and willingness to pay, we find in many of these surveys and experiments a pretty strong link. So I think what's happening in many areas of India is that people receive very poor quality service from the government, and then they think, well, if the government isn't doing their work, why should we pay? And one way you can try to break out of this bad equilibrium is improving the service and then going to the people and saying, we've improved the service, now please start paying. One state that has made exceptional progress in improving quality is Bihar, and it will be very interesting then to go and see if payment rates, collection rates, billing rates, if all of these things are improving. Because this could go wrong in so many ways, right? You improve the quality of service, payment rates remain low, that just means you're bleeding even more. So it's really important that you get both of these things happening at the same time.
So how do you do that?
I think the connection here is that you need to kind of build the social license and the political support for higher prices and collections by first improving the service and then at the same time implementing more efficient collection actions against theft and so on. But the big problem, I think, with the state governments and state-owned distribution companies is that if they go and they, let's say, crack down on theft in the current system, then in the next elections they get thrown out. So you really need to get people to think that because of this better quality service, it's necessary to pay, and the government has every right to ask for this money.
So, and perhaps several of you can speak to this, but are you seeing the government doing enough to help change that mentality that it's worth paying for more? Because in the trips we took to India this past year, if there was one thing that was made clear to us was that the cheaper the better. Affordability is key. So asking people that actually really don't have anything to pay more, how are you going to convince them, that it's worth doing so?
Well, I think it's very important not to start with the very poor rural people. The consumption there is so low that even if they steal 100% of that electricity, it's not going to have much of an impact on the power sector finances. The problem is the wealthier people, the farmers, the big land. I'm not speaking of subsistence farmers. Right. I'm thinking of big landowners in Punjab and Haryana and places like that. That's where the problem is. What you need to do is you need to get the people who consume large amounts of electricity to make the payments. And that's really the starting point for all this.
Jane, did you want to add anything to this?
Yeah, I think one of the models that has been successful in changing this mindset is the mobile pay-as-you-go apps, because people have now gotten used to paying for their cell phone coverage in that way. Right. That if I put $10 or whatever number of rupees on my phone or on my meter, my smart meter from my grid, and I waste a lot of that energy, and after a week or two it's gone, then I have nothing left for the rest of the month. So I think it makes people much more conscious of how much they're using, what they're using it for, and it becomes a more valuable commodity when they can see it. But I think when they visualize it as a remote operation in some power plant, and they can't really see what's happening, or own it, it doesn't seem they don't seem to care as much, right? So I do think that some of these more innovative, modern, technologies will eventually help, change that mindset.
So there is a positive angle to technology and machines a little bit. On occasion, I guess.
Listen, I have solar panels on my roof, and every day I look at my app to show how much electrons I'm selling to Pepco. I'm a power plant. And so I love the app in that respect, and I love the technology. I'm simply saying it has limits.
Right. Any other questions? All right. Johannes, you mentioned electricity theft briefly just now. What do you think are ways to effectively tackle electricity theft?
I think the most important, simple first step would be to create a data system that you can actually see electricity theft, so that you would know that in this area from this feeder we are really missing lots of electricity. And you would probably want to make it, I think, as transparent, as open as possible, so that people can also challenge the government, ask, why is it that the Prime Minister's district has 60% losses? What's happening here? It's very common that political VIPs are associated with lots of electricity theft because nobody dares to go in there and collect. So that's number one. And I do think then the second step would be this strategy where you provide better service and then you condition that on supply. Maharashtra did some very interesting experiments in the past where they went to communities and villages and they said that the supply of electricity is conditional on the payment rate. If you reach 50%, we'll give you 8 hours. If you reach 60%, we'll give you 10 hours. 70% will be 12, and so on and so on. And if you get over, let's say, 90%, we will give you 24 hours. Because now this smaller community has an incentive to enforce internally their behavior. It's not easy to do. They tried this in Bihar and it failed because the politicians interfered and they prevented the people from doing this. So it's not easy to do. But as an idea, I think it has some promise.
Right. Okay. Any other questions? Damn, you guys are brutal. Okay, so I think we'll actually, Lauren, do you want to add anything else on the private sector engagement front that, I don't know, I would like to hear more on private sector. There's been, on Asia Edge, on any of these programs, gas, there's been a ton of investments as India is tackling all these issues. What are some of the opportunities we can look at?
I think, some of the programs that Griff mentioned, as well as Jane, there's Asia Edge, there's Clean Energy Finance Task Force, there's the U.S.-India Gas Task Force. We've seen a lot of interest from the private sector in being part of those mechanisms.
But it's mostly gas focused, right?
Not all of them. The Gas Task Force, obviously.
Right.
Coming up with joint recommendations from U.S. and Indian industry on how India can, achieve its gas ambitions. But in the Clean Energy Finance Task Force, when I was still in the government and working with Griff on it, there was...
Right, you were at DOE before this.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the State Department, yes. But, when we launched that, there was a ton of private sector interest in, having a seat at the table and helping the government think through these issues and, then coming up with best practices, creating frameworks where, U.S. best practices and standards were there. And that all helps, the industry be active in the market, which in turn, creates jobs.
Right.
Better, economic situation for folks so that they can pay for energy, which increases energy access. And then you bring in innovation, we're talking about smart grids, pay-as-you-go payments, metering. Industry all has a role to play in that and bring the innovation in, as long as there's an enabling environment for them to be active.
Right. The other three of you, any last remarks on, positive twist, perhaps, of what's, opportunities, what more can we do, anything else we should be thinking of before we come to a close?
Sure, Bean. I just want to follow up on what Lauren said and concluded her comments were regarding innovation. And unfortunately, we have, and I mentioned this earlier in the green room, I swear to God, if you want to improve attendance at any gathering, throw the word innovation into the title. that will gather more and more people. Everybody loves innovation. Who isn't for innovation? But as Lauren just pointed out, innovation is much more than innovating the hardware. And unfortunately, in our culture, when we think about innovation, again, we think about innovating the gadget. And I'm not a Luddite. I love the technology. It just has its role. We just keep fixating on improved means to an unexamined end. It's like the Buddha when he's talking about the finger pointing to the moon. We're fixated on the finger, and if we keep fixating on the finger, the technology, the means, we're going to lose sight of the moon. And what Lauren is telling us, quite rightly, we need more innovation on policy, finance models. The institutional innovation is what's inhibiting these machines, these technologies, whether it's gas, coal, renewable energy, energy efficiency, they're cost effective. What's inhibiting them is stale and antiquated institutions. Because those institutions were designed to accommodate a previous generation of fuels. Renewable energy and energy efficiency requires different types of policy and regulatory scaffolding and systems. So I just plead everybody, when you think of innovation, innovating behavior, innovating institutions, innovating our...
It's a full package.
It's a full package.
Right.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Jonas.
I'm just a simple small town boy. It's hard to follow after the Buddha, but the one thing I have seen in India that I think is really has improved is local capacity for this kind of policy engagement. It's pretty incredible if you go to Delhi these days, how many more people there are who understand these issues very well, who are very active and kind of hold the government accountable for doing this. The problem is that this is all happening in the center, and then when you go to the state level, this kind of capacity is missing. So that's really, I think the opportunity here is that if we could repeat that success in some of these state capitals, especially in the northern states where almost all of these problems are, I think that would be really a game changer for India.
Great. Jane, last words.
Yeah, I guess I'll just mention, and maybe be discussed in the next panel, the attack on the nuclear power plant in India, the largest nuclear plant.
Yeah, we'll have Ted Jones.
Right, which is a bit scary. But under Asia Edge, we are rolling out some cybersecurity work throughout the Indo-Pacific region. I think this will be a growing area of concern for a number of countries. And then you asked for the positive note. I would say one positive development in India in their policy has been to allow for more regional power trade in South Asia. South Asia remains one of the least connected regions in the world, not just on energy, but in trade and other areas. So now Nepal can trade with Bangladesh through India.
Yeah.
And so I think that will make the whole region more secure. It will allow for bigger balancing areas for renewables, and it'll help India's energy security. So there's not just bilateral deals with India and other countries, but now eventually, hopefully, there'll be a regional power market and power pool. And I think that will bring down the cost. That will be savings for the region once we get to that point. So.
Well, and actually interconnections in South and Southeast Asia and in the Gulf and whatnot is actually one of our themes in Abu Dhabi in January as well. So we'll be having a lot more discussions on that front as well with different players. I'd like to thank you all for being here. We're going to go to a coffee break. I think we'll be reconvening here at 11 a.m. for our final panel, so please stick around. The next panel will be focusing on the geopolitics of the energy security, so we hope to see you back then. Thank you.
We're missing one of our speakers. Very good. Good morning. Thank you, everyone, for sticking around for this discussion of India's energy security. My name is Irfan Nuruddin. I'm the director of the South Asia Center at the Atlantic Council and also professor of Indian politics at Georgetown University. It's a real pleasure to have this opportunity to engage with these very high-powered individuals on this particular question of energy security. Let me remind everyone, if you during the break turn your phones back on to make sure that they're muted and silent. Also, for those of you joining late, that this is being web streamed live and recorded. It will be archived on the Atlantic Council website. So as Randy said at the start, don't do anything that you might be embarrassed about in 20 years. Nothing ever dies on the internet. We're going to jump right in. It's already been a fascinating morning, a lot of big issues arising from the fact that we have this great opportunity to have Shreerupa Mitra with us and the launch of, here in Washington, of her edited volume on Energizing India. We've talked a lot about energy access. We're going to pivot now to thinking about energy security. On the one hand, of course, the energy access issue, as was suggested at the very end of the conversation in the last panel, is intrinsically linked to questions of energy access, but that's especially when we think of energy security at the individual level. We're going to zoom out and actually think about energy security at the national level, so we can think a little more of the geopolitics and the geoeconomics of energy security. To have that conversation, I'm going to go from my left to the right. We have Shreerupa Mitra. Those of you who weren't here earlier, she is Executive Director of the Energy Forum, a research policy think tank in New Delhi. Welcome again to Washington and to the Atlantic Council. To her left is Nolti Theriot, who is a representative with the US-India Strategic Partnership Forum, USISPF. Before joining USISPF, Nolti worked at the US Chamber of Commerce, including a number of years heading the energy advocacy work for the US-India Business Council. He was Director of Congressional Affairs for the National Oceans Industries Association, which is a major oil and offshore gas association in the United States as well. So a lot of very relevant experience. We then have Ted Jones, who's Director currently of the National Security and International Programs at the Nuclear Energy Institute. He's been doing that since last year. Before that, he spent 8 years at the Nuclear Energy Institute, focused as Director of Supplier International Affairs. And then finally, we have Amos Hochstein from Tellurian here, who's a Senior Vice President at Tellurian, having joined the company in 2017 after working at the US as US Special Envoy for International Energy Affairs at the US State Department's Bureau of Energy Resources. So in many ways, we have a very diverse group, but if you were paying attention, you know, right, we have 2 alums of USIBC, I think, on the panel, and we have at least 2 from the State Department, including the many that we saw in the last panel. So that network is clearly extremely influential, and we're very grateful to all of you for being here. So what I'm going to do is, over the next little bit, is start this conversation by trying to get our colleagues to help us think about what it means to think about energy security, what are the big challenges to that, what are the roles of the different actors, both governmental and private sector actors, in achieving energy security. And since we have this great opportunity to have, you know, friends of India, in a sense, but also someone who's in Delhi, plugged into the policy and government networks, to actually force a little bit the conversation of the harder stuff, right? We know what private sector would like to do. We know what the government would like them to do. Why can't they get it done? And what do we need to change on both sides in order to get there? So that's kind of what I hope the conversation will be about. And I hope, of course, that many of you will have questions to push them to expand on other issues that you want to hear about. So we'll start then with Shreerupa. So Shreerupa, from just maybe you can help us define terms, right? Right now in Delhi, when people talk about energy security, what are they talking about? What are the big parameters that we're trying to get right? What are the big challenges that you see on the footing? So set the agenda for us.
Thank you, Irfan. I think when you say energy security, our biggest challenge is import dependency. We import about 84% of our crude and about 50% of our gas. And given the very volatile situation that in the Middle East, that throws up surprises every now and then. So I think there have been a number of steps that have been taken recently, which some of them I mentioned in my discussion with Randolph, right. But I'll repeat. So there are about 28 sedimentary basins in India. They have been largely unexplored. So I spoke of the recent HELP policy, the HELP policy and the open acreage licensing policy, where private stakeholders are given the freedom to carve out their own blocks, and a single license for exploring conventional and non-conventional fuels and things like that, and discovered small fields where you can have that's called the DSF scheme. So that is one part. Then there is also enhancing recovery from already existing fields. So how do you do that? Technology. We heard a lot about technology in the last panel, but digitalization and just increasing the efficiency of oil fields. Then there is, of course, a huge thrust on biofuels, and the national biofuel policy was set in place in 2018, where you expanded the feedstock of biofuels. And so there is an stated objective of 10% replacement by 2020 with biofuels. That would be 10% less of crude import. If that happens, again, these are all tall orders, and a lot of enabling environment has to be created. So that is one, and then of course renewables, to have more energy democracy. Every country has its own resources. How do you have technology for solar, wind? These are things that India is taking. We've heard the Prime Minister say for 50 gigawatts, and solar is, and the establishment of ISA. So these are steps which are being taken very seriously to really reduce, or at least attempt reducing import dependency. Also, by energy security is diversifying our sources. So we've started LNG import from the US. It has touched $6 billion in 2 years, and it'll just go up, I'm sure. We need the gas, and then not only from the US, we are diversifying to UAE, to Russia, to and then energy security would also mean preparing ourselves for emergency situations. So for building strategic petroleum reserves, for instance. So we have 3 SPRs that are being built in Padur, in Mangalore, and in Orissa. So ADNOC has already agreed to fill in one of the SPRs, and we are in talk with Aramco. So this broadly, this is what is meant by energy security when in policy terms in Delhi.
So what's interesting there is really Shreerupa helps forces us to think about 2 different dimensions of this. One is this notion of reducing import dependency, but on the other hand, you have a very different dimension, which is changing the mix of those imports. And in fact, India could arguably achieve energy security without reducing import dependency, but with a very different mix of it. And when I think about the big Howdy Modi event in September, really there was a lot to watch. Right, it was a good old tamasha by any Indian definition. But one of the really substantive outcomes of this was the announcement of the Petronet Tellurian MOU on LNG. And since we have Amos here, maybe you could help us think, right, maybe somewhat responding to Shreerupa, this would still be imports, but it very much moves India in the direction of changing potentially the mix of what it's importing, the mix of its energy supply. what is the state of that MOU? Where are you, what should we be expecting to come out of it, and what do you see as the future where LNG is concerned?
Thank you, and thank you for the Atlantic Council for doing this focus on India and India energy, and for having me. It's obviously a great honor and a privilege to sit with, especially with Shri being here in Washington and having the opportunity to sit with you on this panel. I think that if I can break it down into a few pieces, thinking
Please.
about how, just listening to Shreerupa right now, giving such a good overview of how does one think about energy security in the context of India, and I'll get to where I think Tellurian fits into it. India is today, one of the fastest growing economies of this kind of scale. So when we look around the world where growth is going to come on the demand side for energy, India and China are really the story, because even though you have economic growth in Europe, in the energy sector, the energy intensity, efficiency rates there are more than compensating for demand increase, which means that, for instance, if you look at the UK, total generation of power over the last 20 years has actually declined, even though you have GDP growth. And that's because of efficiency rates are there. But India is in a different stage of development where the economy is really especially under Prime Minister Modi, has grown significantly. So you have a economic growth boom that is, in order to fuel it, literally fuel it, requires a big step up in energy consumption. So when you look at the energy security and energy demand, we're at a place where I think we're going to see tremendous growth in order to be able to get there. If you look at the goals stated by Prime Minister Modi for the first term, and then as he stated them for the second term, energy access, electrification, and now that was in the first term, and you see the progress there as far as the numbers of people who have access to electricity of various kinds. And now you really have to start looking at, okay, but what does that look like? And two things come to mind for me. One is, yes, the growth in renewables, and it's coming from a relatively low base. So even with a significant growth in renewables, that is still percentage-wise is going to struggle to keep pace with energy demand growth overall. And you have now, both for the power sector and for the air quality changes that we want to look at. So we've all been following the air quality in India, the big cities in India of worsening. And it has a number of factors. Some of them have nothing to do with energy, crop burning, and so on. That's going to have to be dealt with in a different way. But changing the fuel mix for not just power, but in the fleet, in the trucks, buses, and so on, is going to have to change as well. And you see government taking action. And let me get finally to gas, where obviously a little bit more of a day-to-day concern for me. Prime Minister Modi has talked about supporting the economic growth to a $5 trillion economy and supporting that with a gas-based economy, if I quote the English translation correctly of what he has said several times. A gas-based economy, the first step that the Prime Minister has announced and Minister Pradhan has announced, means taking the economy from a 6% gas in the energy mix to 15%, which is the overall sort of the global average for developed countries of the role of gas in the energy mix. That's huge. That is an enormous number. But if you look at the stage of development, most countries that are where they are in development, the further they are in development, the closer they are to 15%. So the fact that India is at about 6%, I think today, 6.5%, China's at about 7%. Even if you don't get to 15%, if you only did half of that growth, that's 100 million tons, or nearly 100 million tons to get there. That's a lot of gas. And that allows you to benefit from additional exploration and domestic production in India. And it allows India to benefit from the fact that LNG prices have come down. The barrier has been, and the challenge in India has been, price. India is a very price-sensitive economy when it comes to the energy market, and specifically when it comes to gas. So if you can look at how to diversify away from the Middle East potentially and have a more diverse global portfolio of LNG that comes in, and looking at the sensitivity and the elasticity of the market to price, that you have to get into that sweet spot of being able to have access to it and making sure it's from a source that is geopolitically is a secure supply and can come in at a price. And I think as long as you can come into India at below $7, $6.50, you can do well. And it's from a supplier perspective, and the demand is going to be there. And the lower you can go on that scale below $7, the more that will generate additional demand and will significantly enhance investment. So we were very excited to have many months of talks with Petronet. We were happy to be able to get to the stage where we got, which is an MOU for up to 5 million tons of supply starting in 2023 into India. Still a lot more work to do to finish the commercial work there with Petronet and its partners. But for us, this is a long-term view. We view India as an exciting market of tremendous growth. We want to be there for the long run. We want to start at the floor in India. So this is really a good opportunity for us to begin our work in India in a market that I believe will continue to grow and surprise analysts. Analysts tend to talk about China all the time, and that's because how much investment there was and the quadrupling of imports into China. But if you look at the numbers in India of imports of LNG, they are very impressive growth numbers there. And where I'll end is, I think the real difference for a company like ours that wants to look at stability not only on the supply side but in India, the fact that Prime Minister Modi in second term named Minister Pradhan to come back to or stay in this ministry for us was a very big deal. What he has been able to do in that ministry has been phenomenal. The investment or rather leading the change in the structure of the gas sector. And if you look at the city gas bid round and you read some of the international analysts' expectation of how that would go and then compare it to how it actually went, there was a huge gap. There was all the skepticism and yet it was done open, transparent, fair, and there was a lot of interest. The bids were good. It was diverse interest from different companies. And most importantly, this is now leading to actually putting money and capacity into increasing the infrastructure. We've talked about demand in India for a long time in gas, but the infrastructure wasn't there. So when you look at a country the size of India with only 15,000 kilometers worth of pipelines, and all of a sudden talking about including 16,000 kilometers of additional pipeline capacity, that is a game changer. And when you bring the private sector in India to make investments in those pipelines, in the city gas, and companies like Total making investments into the receiving terminal infrastructure, you can understand why a company like ours wants to be in India. There's real demonstration of actual investment in the infrastructure that means that we can not only do the deals that we've announced, but grow our investments there and growing our investments in India into the future.
Thank you. That was remarkably comprehensive, also remarkably optimistic, which is not often words you put together in any conversation about the policy environment in India, in my experience. So that's great. We'll get to the other stuff later, I suspect. I just want to make sure, for those of you who sort of don't have all your politician trading cards always, Mr. Pradhan, who was referred to a couple of times by Amos, is the Honorable Minister for Petroleum and Natural Gas, also holds the steel portfolio, and that's Mr. Dharmendra Pradhan. Nolti, where we ended right there was a perfect segue from your perspective now at US ISPF, representing not just a company, but many companies interested. in increasing the private sector role in this conversation about energy security in India. So what are you seeing that's really exciting over there? And maybe you can queue up for us, maybe we won't get there quite yet. What are some of the challenges that exist, but what's exciting right now?
Sure. Right now what's exciting, some of the policies that Minister Pradhan put in place, the help policies, open acreage, incentives for deep water. We represent a lot of the major U.S. oil and gas companies, and I think, this year was the first time in many years where you had, Exxon at the table signing MOUs with ONGC, the largest national oil company, to look at projects offshore. They've also signed MOUs with Gale to look at some midstream projects. So I think that's really been exciting. Shifting gears to the LNG exports, we also represent the U.S. companies exporting from the U.S. and the Indian oil and gas companies importing. And while the big deals with Cove Point and Cheniere were a huge success, what Amos said, the price sensitivities is a huge issue, and the infrastructure bottlenecks are still an issue. Out of all the exports, the current exports from the U.S., really only 5 shipments have landed in India and have been utilized in India. The majority of them have been shipped to, sold in other countries, so they didn't really make it to India. So, I think, the U.S. industry needs to work with the Indian government in these to resolve the infrastructure bottlenecks. U.S. industry is committed to these investments. The opportunity is huge, and then I think there's opportunities in biofuels, as Shreerupa mentioned. A lot of our companies are interested in manufacturing projects in India, in the short term to help India meet the blending targets, I believe around 9%. I think the short-term fix would be increase exports from the U.S., ethanol, other biofuels, while the manufacturing infrastructure increases. And of course, renewable energy has been a success story. A lot of the solar and wind companies are now struggling in some states like Andhra Pradesh because of contract sanctity issues. I think contract sanctity issues is going to be important across the board, whether it's oil and gas, LNG, renewable energy, coal, and regulatory consistency is another key.
Your mention of Andhra Pradesh makes me want to ask you a little bit about what you're seeing right now from the states. Obviously, US ISPF, like US IBC and others, has been forcing, I think, and helping American companies recognize that states are huge actors, not just in terms of the constitutional responsibilities they have, but their sheer size, right? I mean, Maharashtra is a state of 120 million people. That's a very large country in its own right. What are you seeing in terms of business savviness about engaging states directly, or is this a sector in which all roads to India must pass through Delhi first?
The states play a critical role. I mean, as I just mentioned, in Andhra Pradesh, you had a number of solar wind companies sign PPAs, power purchase agreements, develop projects. New chief minister comes in, and the state wants to force the companies to renegotiate. So unfortunately, in a couple of states, we're hitting roadblocks. But a lot of the progressive states, companies are spending a lot of time because there's hurdles that they could face in the states. Going back to Andhra Pradesh, we've gotten a lot of support from MNRE, Ministry of Finance. They understand the impacts of these issues and have been very supportive of trying to resolve some of these contract sanctity issues. So, we feel good about the central government backing and trying to resolve these issues.
Great. So, Ted, if I can bring you into this conversation, one might argue that all of these conversations we've had today about energy security, right, kind of are missing the big picture if we don't have a serious conversation about the role nuclear energy could play in that. And Dr. Summers, in the very end of the last panel, mentioned sort of the need to think about nuclear issues. So from your perspective, what should we know about sort of the state of play when nuclear is in the energy mix, the role it could play, and maybe what are the challenges to getting there?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Atlantic Council, for hosting this conference and for inviting me to talk about nuclear in this context, because nuclear has some huge contributions to make for India's energy security, the topic of this panel, and other security needs, climate security, clean air, and more. You know, in this country, we have nuclear power contributing about 1/5 of all of our power. That's well over half of our clean, zero carbon emitting power. And we've taken for granted here the value of a diversified energy mix, and what that means for energy security. We didn't do it by design. It's just sort of happened this way. We have a great deal of coal still, and quickly being displaced by gas, a growing share of renewables, and we've had this steady contribution from nuclear it's helped the energy security of the United States and other national interest. India has huge ambitions for energy security and long-standing plans for nuclear to play a role in that. And it is not materialized according to the schedule that has been laid out for many years. There was a great promise in 2005 that the U.S. and India could make nuclear energy cooperation the centerpiece of a strategic partnership to further India's energy security needs. And I think there remains, recognition and expectation on both sides that this will all come to pass. We have certainly, we've been engaged at the Nuclear Energy Institute, and I know the bilateral business councils are also engaged in helping to promote this. For India, it is zero carbon, always on power that is that could contribute to energy security and other needs. It's down the road. I think that there's the potential for new nuclear technologies to fulfill additional roles in India that would uniquely suit India's needs. Smaller designs are they're cheaper. They'll be safer. Some of them have an emergency preparedness zone that is coextensive with the site boundary for the plant. So these plants could be located in densely populated areas. Smaller, they would fit the grids, and some of them can ramp up and down their power and would be able to serve all sorts of needs to complement renewables, for one, because we all know the sun doesn't shine all the time. You have to have power to back that up. And if you are really serious about reducing carbon emissions, then we need to do that in a zero carbon emitting fashion. So what are the barriers to India's nuclear energy development and to U.S. participation in that sector? The big barrier is I think remains liability. Now, in 2010, India adopted some liability regulations that radically departed from global practices. And when Modi was first elected, one of his first actions was to address this problem, which I think everybody recognized would be a barrier. And he did a really good job of creating an insurance pool and to provide insurance to suppliers that try to close this exposure gap. I don't think it's been enough. I mean, I don't think I have to make that argument. I think the fact that there hasn't been more activity in the sector, despite a strong interest on both the Indian and U.S. private sector sides to do it, shows that to be the case. I think that another serious effort now after Modi's re-election could probably close the remaining, satisfy the remaining questions. I think if both sides are willing to move a little bit, I think perhaps this could result in Westinghouse concluding contracts for the large plants that have been planned for so long. This would be fantastic, and it would pave the way for the next generation of technologies. There are so many ways that the U.S. and Indian sectors can play in a complementary way. India needs power. Here's technology to do it in a sustainable way. India has a tremendous amount of engineering and manufacturing expertise, Larsen & Toubro and many other companies. The U.S. companies have innovative technologies and are looking for supply chain. So with markets and supply chain, we can build plants in India, here, and in third countries. So I do hope we can meet these challenges and do it soon.
Very good. Yes, I think for a lot of us, we remember what a big deal the 2007 Indo-US civil nuclear deal was, how much political capital was invested in that, and it does seem that we haven't really enjoyed the fruits of the hard work that it took to get to that agreement in some sense. So in that conversation, we've already begun to see some of the potential obstacles. So I'm going to identify what I heard you guys say and maybe add a couple more, and then we could sort of open it up to the panel for, and maybe we'll stick with the three of you to begin with, to maybe think about which of these challenges are particularly salient, which you think we need solutions to. So I heard contract sanctity, right? I mean, in particular, the sort of somewhat Indian penchant for renegotiating things, whether it's contracts, whether it's sort of retrospective taxation and sort of the way that looms over certain companies still. There is the large question of land acquisition and the difficulties of it, and a lot, I'm not an energy person, but what I have read and understood is that much of what we'd like to do is going to require pretty large expanses of land to be purchased largely from farmers, and both governments, both the UPA2 government, but also the NDA government between 2014 and 2019 have worked hard at land acquisition. Arguably, it's better today, more business friendly today than it was 10 years ago, but it's still a long ways from where business would like it to be. So land acquisition, infrastructural difficulties, and sort of we can get the oil to the ports, but can we get it in, and the challenges of discoms. But I want to add one other, right, which is data localization and issues over there. So on the one hand, we are talking a lot about data localization in the context of US-India trade more generally. I imagine a lot of your clients at US ISPF bring this up periodically, but in the context of energy in particular, right, when we think of cybersecurity issues, cyber attacks, et cetera, when we think about the exposure of foreign companies, if we think of smart grids and the Internet of Things or any of that, it's data is at the core of it, and the Indian government right now is taking a very particular position on data localization. If any of you are willing, I'd love to hear sort of how you think that affects this larger conversation about the private sector's ability to engage or willingness to engage in India on energy, because the energy stuff might be fixed, they might get the prices right, but now there's this data piece that they've got to think through as well. So any of those issues, which for you would you say, Santa Claus, fix this and then everything else will be better in 2020? Which of these is the biggest issue for you? Any of you? This is the time to make trouble. So, and then Shreerupa will go back to Delhi and fix all the troubles. So,
I don't want to touch the data localization issue, but I will go to the land issues. I mean, that is a big problem, yes. Whether you're talking about getting land and clearances for solar projects, right-of-ways for transmission lines, gas lines. It is a challenge, if we could get some of these clearance issues taken care of in the front end, it'd be a lot easier to attract some of these investments. Of course, we talked about the contract sanctity issue. That's the other big one, policy consistency. I think those are the three big issues, kind of plaguing the energy sector.
Okay.
I take a little bit of a counter narrative to what you normally, and you alluded to it before in Washington, is very negative on when it comes to trade with India. There's a lot of negativity in the conversation because of all the challenges that exist. And I think that from the U.S. perspective, I'm going to take my Tellurian hat off, but sort of someone who worked in government for a while and spent some time in India and shared a few efforts together with my counterparts in India to try to improve, whether it was in renewable energy, finance. There are some challenges of navigating both taking that step up in the energy sector of trying to grow it quite quickly with the challenges of a growing economy and a developing country and the size of India. And I think we as the US, both in the private sector and in the government, I think we are too aggressive in our expectations. First, I believe I should always look in the mirror before I look at my counterparty. And some of the things that we talk about as challenges in India are not that easy here. So energy infrastructure in the United States is a quite cumbersome process, and I don't know an energy company that doesn't wish that the state, local FERC was not an easier process here in the US, and we have about 150 years of experience in this sector. And so it's quite complicated. We have multiple agencies. I mean, if you want to regulate a pipeline that crosses a border between oil, gas, or other liquids, you're in completely different jurisdictions of who does that. And every state is different and every local area is different. There are states in the United States that don't allow certain energy infrastructure to be built at all. Look at New York, others, Texas or Louisiana. They're very different, and even Texas and Louisiana are very different from each other. You want to go negotiate right-of-ways in Louisiana, it's a lot easier than doing it in Texas. There are all kinds of peculiarities about our system. So we have been, I think, rightfully hoping that India develops a regime a regulatory regime that would make things easier. But to expect that to happen overnight, I think, is unrealistic. I think it's also incumbent upon us to not say that our trade relationship overall should be equal. And what we do in the United States towards Indian companies should be the same thing as what India allows American companies. We are in entirely different stages of economic development. We are in entirely different stages, size of economy. And so I think that we should allow India to make those changes more incrementally. I think we should put the pressure for that change to happen, but expect it to be incremental rather than somehow equal access that the US does. Even if we are not equal, we will benefit as a country and as an economy for this incremental changes and allow local communities in India to not get pushed to the side as the larger cities advance. So you want to be able to make sure that the Indian government is able to bring all of India up and not just city centers and urban areas where you have more US investment of big companies. And to do that, I believe the energy sector that often gets forgotten in the conversation on overall US-India trade is critical. Because the more you want to do in the non-urban areas for growth, you're not going to get foreign investment unless there is access to reliable and affordable sources of energy. So if you don't have if a company doesn't know that it's going to have a power supply that is going to be there 24/7 and is going to be reliable 24/7 and affordable, they're not going to make that investment. They're not going to build the data center. They're not going to build all these other things that we talk about, is all dependent on this energy investment and growth. So when I look at the challenges ahead, I still think that there are areas for improvement. I think that it would be great to do things more quickly. And I think that sometimes that's a challenge for foreign companies doing business in India, is the pace of movement in getting approvals and negotiations compared to other places, renegotiating of contracts of already signed contracts that I think you mentioned earlier is a critical piece. But I will say that for us, the experience so far in the gas sector, the reason that we wanted to enter the country and have these negotiations is because we saw what happened over the last few years. I don't know that we would have put as much effort and put India at the top tier for us as a country that we want to have investments in 5 years ago. I think we would have been a lot more cautious. I think over the last couple of years of seeing the progress that both the Prime Minister has articulated, but the Ministry has really been able to push forward, we've seen governments in India articulate policy that hasn't necessarily been pushed through the system. What we have seen the last couple of years is really that pushing through the system. And so you mentioned the Howdy Modi. For us, we didn't know that this was going to happen, but the fact that the Prime Minister participated in our the signing of the exchange of the documents, I think signaled to us and to the system in India. So I think when you look at the challenges, I see more opportunities than challenges, but I do see some challenges that I think are we can overcome. I just hope that, again, this is not about the gas industry, but more just as an American businessman, I think that we would like to see the U.S. view India a little bit differently in how we talk about the trade negotiations, how we think about the trade relationship.
I think you just saw why.
That's not a Tellurian policy, by the way. I should say that.
I think we just saw why you were probably a very good diplomat before you became an industry rep as well. Ted, do you want to add anything to any of this?
No, I would just say that, I already talked about the liability issue. In the nuclear sector, I think that, there's some obstacles that are underestimated, like liability, that's just been, I think, conveniently ignored. And then there are some issues that are way overblown. And I think many of us read about the cyber attacks at the Kudankulam nuclear plant. I'm not sure what I believe and what I disbelieve in some of those reports. Some of it clearly is not right. I know in the United States, nuclear power plants are among the most robust industrial structures we have, and they're very resistant against physical and cyber attacks by design, and it just doesn't even really register as a concern. Land acquisition is an issue in the nuclear sector in India. It's something that Nuclear Power Corporation of India is doing for the plants they would import from the United States, and I think they're pretty far along. But putting my old U.S.-India Business Council hat on, I know how many different problems there are that are real and that need to be solved if there is going to be the level of trade investment and investment that both sides want. So I get that.
I want to turn to Q&A, but before I do that, I want to give you a chance maybe to talk about the geopolitics of this, right? I mean, so 2 months ago, almost to the day, in this room, we had External Affairs Minister Dr. Jaishankar at a roundtable at the Atlantic Council. And one of the things he did both here but also throughout his trip in Washington was emphasize that while India sees the United States as a critical strategic partner in the 21st century, that India's fundamental philosophy is that it has many friends, and that, the old-fashioned sort of, we are your friend and therefore we won't be anyone else's friend, is not how India thinks of its alliances or its partnerships. That's fundamentally about geopolitics and that perspective. In the context of energy, if you could help us think about or understand what the current thinking in Delhi is, both in the intelligentsia, in the policy world, about how to balance a growing partnership with the United States, a historic old partnership maybe with Russia, the relationships in the Middle East, Iran, which you touched upon in the opening panel with Randy, is an old friend of India's, so that suddenly India sort of got caught in the middle of a fight that was not of its making. So what is the thinking that's coming out of the MEA, that's coming out of the folks who are thinking on the energy security issues where geopolitics is concerned?
Well, without speaking for the government, I can tell you my thinking.
Please.
So I was at an event the other day, and somebody asked me, so I was speaking about import of LNG, so from the US, and the gentleman asked me, so why does India still considers Russia as a better friend, So I really don't think that's, it's not a question of a better friend or a worse friend, who's a better friend. It's just that, trade with Russia doesn't come at the cost of the US. If you see, it has, our partnership has grown tremendously, and I keep emphasizing this. And I would agree totally with Minister Jaishankar that as a developing nation, we have many friends. We need to have many friends. Our needs are vast. From the energy point of view, I've given the statistic before, but we are just 1/3 of per cap of energy consumption of the global average. So we have a huge amount of. It's an aspirational population. It's a very young population, and so I really don't see that one relationship comes at the cost of the other. Really. If you're not in my camp, you're in the other camp. It's really not how that should work. And I completely agree with all of what Amos said. That I don't want to repeat what he said, but and the Middle East, of course, we've been getting all our crude from there, and but we've also been sort of negotiating because we have an Asian premium, which is a higher cost to the crude that we pay. So it becomes imperative for us, because it's such a price sensitive country, to diversify, not only because it's volatile. Yeah, so.
Okay, thank you. Let's open up to question and answer. There are microphones available, so would anyone like to get us started? So, good.
Thank you. Thank you for the very fascinating discussion. So I'm Jacob Lee from Johns Hopkins University. My question is about public awareness and acceptance toward nuclear power in India. So I think the public acceptance is very important because it affects or influences the politics. So for example, in Japan, after the Fukushima reactor accidents, the public saw nuclear as a threat or unsafe, and it affected nuclear power sector in general. So how do Indian people see nuclear energy, and how are they open to further development in India? Thank you.
It looked like he was addressing that to you, but before you answer that, maybe we can take one more question, if there is one on the floor. No? Okay. Do you have any sense of this?
Your view of this? Yeah, I have a perception, but I think you're closer to it.
Tempted to make the joke about who's catching the nuclear football right now. So, one of you has to answer.
I'm not a competent person to answer this. No, not at all.
Well, Nolty may have and Amos may have ideas about this, but in my experience, Indians are most interested in having reliable power. And even in the days when the U.S. and India were negotiating the details of a nuclear cooperation agreement, and it was kind of grinding along, and there was some opposition from the communist parties, they weren't opposed to nuclear power. They were opposed to cooperation with the United States. And they were even, some of them, asking for nuclear power in their power plants in their own states. So but I know that there are concerns, and there have been issues with some of the plants in India that have raised some concern. But I think the basic takeaway is that it's been broadly supportive.
Anyone else want to add? If I might use the prerogative of the moderator, one of the things I do in my own academic research are a lot of surveys of the Indian public. And it's too bad Johannes is no longer here, because he probably does have data on exactly this question. But I will tell you that when we ask the Indian public questions that include things like, how do you think about Pakistan? About 30 to 40% of the public just says, I don't know or don't have an opinion, right? So if 40% of the population doesn't have an opinion on Pakistan, I guarantee you that they don't have an opinion about nuclear energy. But what is true is that the political elites do. And maybe the question is less about whether or not the public have acceptance, but sort of what is the political cost that will be exacted upon any government who wants to make this by parties elsewhere, right? I mean, right before the government decided not to join RCEP, the opposition had already announced a 10-day agitation starting November 5th if they did enter RCEP, right? I mean, so there's not an economist who probably doesn't think that RCEP would have been a good thing, and yet there was an opposition willing to sort of make trouble for the government had they joined RCEP. You would imagine a similar sort of dynamic, but it's not a public acceptance issue, I would argue. It's more sort of an elite conversation. Other questions? So, can we get a mic? Doesn't appear to be on.
Question from my former colleague, Amos. And Amos, you mentioned about the gas infrastructure development, and that's really important, obviously, as you mentioned, in terms of supplying to these huge markets in the urban areas. But we know from the past that, in a sense, the pricing bottlenecks have been really important. And I think, at one time there was 10,000 megawatts of gas-fired capacity that Essex and other companies had put online. So how do you view this, and what needs to be done on the price policy side to be able to finance this infrastructure? And can you do it without significant power and industrial use of gas? Is there enough basis for just supplying the urban markets?
So I think that, first, I think some of the multi-tiered pricing regimes that existed in the past have already changed quite significantly, and we don't have as many sort of earmarked prices for different sectors the way it was many years ago. And that, I think, has helped flatten out some of the price sensitivity. I think the number is actually almost double. Sri will probably know this better than I will, but as far as stranded gas-fired power plants, I think is in the 20 rather than 10. So it's a lot. But I don't think that necessarily you're going to see LNG gas growth in demand growth go to power. I think you're going to see it going as much to industrial and refining, petrochem, and the auto sector. So your fleet vehicles, very similar to what happened in China over the last few years, where which never happened in the U.S. actually, right? We had buses on CNG, but you developed a trucking industry in China that was fleet vehicles were going to LNG. And I think there's some investments in it in India, and that's an area of growth there. So if you don't look just at what's contracted between now and 2025 versus uncontracted, you actually look at demand growth, just in those sectors alone, you have quite a bit of room for increasing demand. The issue that I saw was a lot more hard infrastructure, so terminals for import, and then the connectivity from the terminal into areas. So, and that's what I was talking about before, the pipelines. So step one was the city gas bid rounds. How many were there, Shri? There were 7. The bid rounds on the city gas, 8. So that brings private sector money into infrastructure and connect. And the idea is now to connect more. If you meet with Minister Pradhan, it's hard to get away from looking at the map of actually all the infrastructure, of trying to get it from one place to the other, and terminals being built in where there weren't before. So the concentration of imports was in one area, in very specific areas in India. So now going to the other side and then starting to connect the infrastructures there. I'll take one point just off the question,
Please.
but something that Shreerupa said before about the idea of Russia and some of the you're with us or against us. I think that you have to separate as a national security view, even from the U.S., where you park your anxieties as an American foreign policy on Iran, Russia, and other competition. If you're talking the defense sector, you can put that in that bucket. If you're looking at nuclear, you can put that in that bucket. But when you start talking about imports of fuels, I really don't find that this is not nationalist. This is about, we shouldn't be telling people not to buy from Russia or yes to buy from Russia. This is not Europe where you have a monopoly status. This is about, can we compete with Russian companies on price? And that's what the competition should be. I don't care, the flag should not be what it's about. And I believe that we can compete on price, and that's where we should park that. And we should separate where we talk about these, you're with us or against us, don't have contracts with other countries. It's where we're trying to export a U.S.-Europe policy into other parts of the world, and I think that it has no room. Iran is a different issue, and we'll have a deal soon with Iran at some point in the next, I don't know, Sarah will know better than I will, and then that will resolve itself. But I think the Russia piece is really not there. I do think you have to look at the security of supply. If you look at what's happening in Iraq right now, I think we're ignoring it at our own peril. I think what's happening in Lebanon and Iraq at the same exact time, that's getting no airtime, no coverage, will come back to haunt us if we don't pay attention to it exactly in this sector. And the countries that will pay a big price for it before the US pays the price economically, it will be exactly India that pays the price if we continue to ignore these national security challenges in the Middle East, which is also why I think the policy of diversifying the supply to the United States, to Russia, to other countries is exactly the right move for India to do.
Thank you. That's a great please go ahead.
I think one policy change that could help with the price is bringing oil and gas under the GST regime. Because right now when you're importing gas into India, every time it gets transported across each state line, there's another pancake tariff that hits. I think that'll alleviate the pricing issues.
Yeah, I mean, one of the interesting things about India, I think, as an observer, analyst, is our willingness both to put very tangible targets, right? 15% reducing import dependency from 84 to 77%, and to put very aggressive timelines attached to that, right? And so that 15% number is by 2030, right, et cetera. So I'm not going to put you guys on the spot and ask you to do a quick, lightning round of how up or down, but it is sort of one of these questions about if India is going to get to any of those goals, right, it needs a lot of help, and therefore there's needs to get a bunch of things fixed in order to bring in the technologies that are available in other parts of the world, to bring in the partnerships in other parts of the world. To that end, the fact that the Global Energy Center here at the Atlantic Council has making South Asia and Southeast Asia a focus of its Global Energy Forum in January in Abu Dhabi is extremely exciting, I think both for India but also for me personally as director of the South Asia Center. And I want to take this opportunity then to thank Randy and Beena for including the South Asia Center in this mini conference, but in particular to thank the many people who've done all the hard work, our events team, our project assistants and assistant directors and interns without whom none of this operates, and of course to thank my fellow panelists for participating. So thank you all for being here. Follow us on atlanticcouncil.org, on the Twitter feed, and this video of today's event, including the earlier panels, will be archived on the website, and please share it with those who could not be here today. So thank you all.